Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we begin, take a moment and write in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're always interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts managed to reach. It was the winter of 1852, when workers renovating the attic of the Sorrelweed House, one of Savannah's most prestigious mansions, came across an object that, at first, seemed like nothing more than a forgotten relic of the pre-Civil War years. Wrapped in dust-stained cloth and leaning face in against the wall was a portrait, oil on canvas, roughly 20 inches by 16. When they turned it over, they saw the face of a young black man. He appeared to be in his early 20s, dressed in formal clothing that did not quite match what anyone would have expected for someone of his station in the antebellum South. His coat was neatly tailored, his shirt front immaculate, his posture calm and composed. The painter had taken great care with the details, the gloss of the fabric, the fold of the collar, the subtle shine on his cheekbones. But what unsettled everyone who saw it was not the clothing. It was the smile. The young man's lips were curved in a practiced, almost gentle expression, not quite joy, not quite submission. His eyes seemed alive in a way the rest of the painting did not. Wherever a viewer stood in that attic, his gaze appeared to follow, as though measuring them, studying them, quietly taking note. Artists of the period sometimes used tricks of perspective and shading to create this effect, but here it felt different, more deliberate, more intent. At first, the portrait was treated as just another artifact. When the Savannah Historical Society later took custody of it, they catalogued it with a plain label, Portrait of Unknown Young Man, Oil on Canvas, c. 1850s, no name, no story, just another face from a time full of faces that history chose not to remember. That changed when someone noticed the writing, faint but unmistakable, in the lower right corner of the canvas, just above the artist's signature area, were a few cramped words, Elijah Brown, property of the Winston estate. It was a single line, but it was enough to change everything. The phrase did not belong in a portrait inscription. Paintings of wealthy planters and their wives carried names, dates, sometimes grand Latin mottos. But this was not a signature of pride. It was a legal designation. Property. The Historical Society added the name to their records, but for decades, nothing more was done. Savannah was crowded with ghost names from ledgers, tombstones, and yellowed bills of sale that no one had time to chase. Elijah Brown became just one more among thousands. More than 20 years passed. Then, in 1873, a man named Thomas Hardwick walked into the Society's storage rooms with a camera and a meticulous eye for detail. Hardwick was not there for ghost stories. He was researching Savannah's architectural history: columns, cornices, floor plans, facades. The portraits stored in the Society's back rooms were, to him, little more than decorative records of the city's former elites, until he saw that painting. In an entry found nearly a century later in his personal journal, Hardwick described the moment he stopped in front of Elijah Brown's portrait. The young man's eyes possess a most peculiar quality, not sadness, not resignation, something else, as though he knows something the viewer does not. Hardwick should have moved on. He had a list of buildings to document, a schedule to keep, but instead, he found himself returning to the portrait again and again, adjusting its angle in the light, stepping closer, stepping back. The smile did not change, the eyes did not move, and yet he could not shake the sense that he was being watched, not as a curiosity, but as a subject of study. Curiosity became irritation. Irritation became obsession. The inscription Elijah Brown, property of the Winston estate, gave Hardwick his first thread to pull. The Winston name still appeared in old county records, even if the family itself had faded from Savannah society after the war. Their former estate lay about 7 miles outside the city's historic core, a once grand plantation, now decaying under vines and weather. According to county documents, the property had changed hands several times since the fall of the Confederacy. By 1873, It was owned by a family named Carmichael, who barely scraped together enough money to maintain the main house and its surrounding fields. They had no interest in the deeper history of the land. When Hardwick requested permission to inspect old records for his architectural survey, they agreed without much thought. On a warm, heavy day in late summer, Hardwick arrived at the Winston estate with notebook, camera, and a growing unease he could not quite explain. The grand avenue that had once led visitors impressively toward the main house was overgrown. The shutters hung crooked over dark windows. The place looked less like a former center of power and more like a house that had been trying, unsuccessfully, to forget itself. Behind the main house stood a small outbuilding, a plain, squat structure that had once housed the overseer. The Carmichaels used it as storage. Old trunks, broken furniture, boxes of rotting paper. It was here that Hardwick began his search. He waded through dust and cobwebs, opening one box after another. Tax receipts, crop tallies, faded letters about shipments and weather and markets. Nothing remarkable, nothing about a portrait, nothing about a man named Elijah. Then he found the leather-bound book. It was small, about 5 by 7 inches, with no title on the cover, only worn brown leather darkened by years of handling. When he opened it, he realized it was not a diary. It was a ledger page, the page of names and numbers. Slaves listed like inventory, age, parentage when known, physical condition, market value, their lives reduced to columns and ink. On page 37, he found it. Elijah Brown, male, age 23, born on property to Martha, deceased, educated as experiment, exceptional aptitude for numbers and letters, potential value as clerk or house servant, $800. Hardwick paused over the phrase educated as experiment. Even in 1850s Georgia, it was an odd notation. Teaching an enslaved person to read and write was considered dangerous at best and outright illegal in many places. Another entry, dated October 12, 1851, expanded on the idea. EB continues to surpass expectations, has begun maintaining secondary ledgers with minimal supervision, demonstrates remarkable recall of transactions. Experiment appears successful. The entries were clinical, but the implication was chilling. Elijah had not simply been allowed to learn. He had been raised and measured like a project, like an experiment in how far control could be stretched while still keeping him firmly classified as property. A later note, from December 3rd, felt different. Concerns regarding EB's growing awareness of his circumstances, has begun asking questions about his mother's fate and his own station. Winston suggests tempering education with reminder of status. Hardwick could almost hear the shift in the plantation owner's voice between those lines. The experiment was no longer just impressive. It was becoming dangerous. At this stage, Hardwick could have closed the ledger, written a dry note about unusual educational practices at the Winston estate, and returned to his architectural surveys. Instead, he kept reading. Instead, he asked questions. On his third visit to the estate, while the Carmichaels went about their business and the afternoon sank into a slow, uneasy quiet, an elderly woman approached him outside the house. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, and she had once been a house servant on the Winston plantation. Hardwick noted in his journal that her hands trembled when she spoke Elijah's name. Mr. Elijah wasn't like the others, she told him. Master Winston brought him into the house when he was just 7, after his mama died. Said the boy had a look in his eyes, a kind of knowing. Taught him his letters and numbers himself. That wasn't done in those days. By 15, Mr. Elijah was keeping all the books. According to Jenkins, Winston liked to show Elijah off to visitors. He would call him into the study, place a ledger or scrap of paper in front of him, and ask him to calculate totals faster than educated white men could manage with pen and ink. The guests would laugh, marvel, whisper about the experiment. Elijah would smile and answer every question. But Sarah remembered something else. When the visitors left, she said, the smile left too. His eyes went different, like he was still looking, still counting, but not the numbers on the page anymore. She told Hardwick about the portrait Winston had commissioned in early 1852, how the master had insisted Elijah practice his smile for weeks before the artist arrived, how Elijah sat, hour after hour, holding that same expression as the painter from Charleston captured him in oils. The painter came and stayed 3 days, she said. Mr. Elijah smiled the whole time, like master told him, but at night, in that little room off the kitchen, where he slept, I'd hear him talking to himself, and writing, always writing. By the time Hardwick assembled these fragments, the attic portrait, the ledger entries, the strange notation educated as experiment, the old woman's memory of a boy trained to smile on command, it was no longer just a curiosity, but it was a pattern. A young man born into slavery, granted an education as a dangerous privilege, a plantation owner obsessed with turning him into proof that intellect could exist in black flesh and still remain under control, a portrait that captured not just a face, but a performance, and behind that performance, something else, something watching. Hardwick did not yet know about the cellar. He had not yet read Winston's private diary. He had not yet seen the carved words inside the drawer of the small desk in the sealed room beneath the house. That would come later. That would be another chapter. For now, in 1873, all he had was a painting in storage, a ledger in his hands, the trembling voice of an old servant, and the growing conviction hard to put into words, but impossible to ignore, that the young man in the portrait was not finished being seen. He was still watching, and he had been waiting a very long time for someone to notice. By the time Thomas Hardwick sat alone at his desk, reviewing his notes about Elijah Brown, nearly a quarter of a century had passed since the young man's name last appeared in any public record. Back then, in the summer of 1852, Savannah had first heard of Elijah in the most predictable way the city knew to describe a black man on the move. A runaway notice. The Savannah Republican ran the advertisement on August 17, 1852. It was small, tucked among sales announcements and shipping reports. Runaway, educated Negro man, answers to Elijah, age 24, can read and write with proficiency, may attempt to pass correspondence as written by a white man, $100 reward for his return to the Winston estate. The notice ran 3 weeks, then stopped. No triumphant follow-up, no captured and returned report. On paper, Elijah simply disappeared in the way most runaways did, into the vast blank space of history, where names were lost and only rumors remained. That was the official story. It wasn't the truth. Hardwick only discovered that years later, when he found something the newspaper ever saw and the city never read, Francis Winston's private diary. The volume was bound in faded red leather, the years 1852 to 1854 embossed on the spine. It had been stored apart from the plantation's financial ledgers, tucked away in a separate box that someone, decades earlier, had labeled simply personal. When Hardwick opened it, he expected pompous reflections, weather, crops, complaints about taxes. What he found instead was a man unraveling. The first reference to Elijah appeared on August 20, 1852, just days after the runaway notice began appearing in the newspaper. He did not escape as reported. Winston wrote, necessity required fabrication upon discovery of his private writings. Contents too unsettling to detail here have secured him in the old storage cellar while determining proper course of action. Sarah instructed to tell all that he has fled north. So Elijah hadn't run, he'd been locked underground. Hardwick read that line over and over. He did not escape as reported. The runaway notice was no record of freedom. It was camouflage. As he turned the pages, the tone of Winston's diary shifted from cold control to growing irritation, then to something darker. An entry dated August 25th was worse. His confinement continues. He shows no remorse. Insists his calculations are correct. Private ledgers kept in secret reveal systematic discrepancies going back 3 years. Funds diverted, transactions altered, extent of deception yet unknown. More troubling than the theft are his writings about the others. He has been observing us as we observed him, noting weaknesses, habits. When questioned, he only smiles. The same smile as in the portrait. It unsettles me greatly. Here, in the cramped ink of an angry man, was the first hint that Elijah's experiment had turned the plantation back on itself. He had been taught numbers as a tool of control. He had turned them into a weapon. Winston's entries in the weeks that followed took on an obsessive rhythm. Elijah's name appeared again and again, a stain that wouldn't come out of the page. He wrote of sleepless nights, of standing in the hallway outside the cellar, convinced he heard someone whispering through the door, of a sound like scratching pen on paper coming from inside. Even when Elijah had supposedly been deprived of anything to write with, on September 10th, Winston reported something that shook even his own certainty. Sarah and 2 others claimed to have seen E in the main house after dark, despite the cellar door remaining locked. Impossible, of course, yet there are new entries in the ledgers in my study in his hand. Figures adjusted, columns altered. Must be a trick of memory or imagination. Nonetheless, have ordered increased night watch. Hardwick underlined that passage 3 times. If Winston could not trust his own eyes inside his own house, if he believed Elijah was appearing where he could not be, writing where he should not be, then whatever had begun as an experiment in controlling a gifted slave had slipped beyond the master's comprehension. The last diary entry that mentioned Elijah came less than a month later, on October 3rd. The matter of E has been resolved permanently. Cellar sealed. Portrait to be removed from study and destroyed. Sarah dismissed for spreading tales among the others. Must now turn full attention to reviewing books of past 3 years and repairing damage to my affairs. No explanation. No description of what resolved permanently meant. No confirmation of death. No record of sale. Just a sealed cellar. A portrait reportedly set aside for destruction, and a man trying very hard to bury both his financial shame and his fear under the authority of his own handwriting. From there, the diary shifted to money, always money. By early 1853, Winston's entries were less about any moral outrage over Elijah's actions and more about the cold facts of his own ruin. Land sold off in parcels, enslaved people liquidated to cover debts, increasingly hostile letters from bankers in Savannah. One such letter, preserved separately among the estate papers and later read by Hardwick, contained a particularly damning line: "The inconsistencies in your recent submissions cannot be dismissed as simple accounting errors." The pattern suggests deliberate manipulation extending across multiple quarters. Winston never wrote about that letter in his diary, but the dates lined up perfectly with the period Elijah had been keeping the books. 3 years of quiet, precise adjustments. One man's fortune hollowed out from the inside. In the official narrative, the Winston family lost their standing because of the uncertainties of war and post-war economic instability. But the private paper trail suggested something else, that before the war ever reached them, a young man they called property had already begun dismantling their wealth. Decimal point by decimal point. By June 1853, the Winston presence in Savannah was over. The family sold what remained of their city holdings and retreated to a smaller property near Augusta. Their old plantation left to decay. The portrait of Elijah supposedly destroyed somehow did not follow them. Instead, within the span of a year, it surfaced where no one could explain it. In the attic of the Sorrelweed house, miles away in the heart of Savannah. There was no documented transfer, no bill of sale for the painting, no note in any surviving correspondence explaining its movement. It had simply gone from being an object Winston wanted out of his sight to a hidden presence above another family's home. Hardwick traced these facts like connecting points on a map: the runaway notice that was never true, the sealed cellar, the failing accounts, the portrait that refused to disappear. But it wasn't until he returned to the Winston estate one last time that he realized the story wasn't finished. On July 7, 1873, he walked through the crumbling main house with the current caretaker, a man named Reynolds, and asked permission to inspect the lower levels, the cellars and storage rooms Winston had once mentioned in his diary. Reynolds agreed, leading him down a narrow staircase into the damp, cool underbelly of the house. Dust floated in the weak lamplight. Old wine racks, empty shelves, discarded crates, ghosts of a vanished household. Among the jumble of chambers, Hardwick noticed one space that didn't quite fit. It was small, roughly 8 feet by 10, with walls thicker than the surrounding rooms and no windows at all. The doorway bore clear signs that it had been sealed at some point, edges uneven, stonework different, an outline where bricks had once filled the frame before being broken out again. When Hardwick asked Reynolds what the room had been used for, the caretaker shrugged. Some kind of secure storage, maybe, he guessed, or a strong room. It was already here when my people took over. We don't use it. Hardwick stepped inside. The room was almost entirely empty. There were no chains on the walls, no obvious signs of confinement, no bones or dramatic evidence of violence like the stories people like to tell themselves about old plantations. Just silence and the faint smell of old stone and wood. Against one wall, however, stood a small desk. It didn't match the other remaining furniture in the house. It was older, more worn, as if it had been carried from somewhere else and left here long before the war. Simple, sturdy, with a single drawer. Hardwick pulled the drawer open. At first, he thought the interior was stained. Then he realized it wasn't discoloration. It was writing. Every surface inside the drawer, the base, the sides, even the underside of the top, had been covered in minuscule, razor-sharp lines carved directly into the wood with something narrow and pointed. There were columns of numbers, grouped like ledger entries, but with no labels to explain what they measured. Between those columns, in an educated, practiced hand, ran paragraphs of text. Hardwick leaned closer, following the carved sentences with his eyes, his breath catching as he recognized the voice there. The longest legible passage read, "They believe the portrait captures only my likeness." The artist was skillful, but inattentive. He did not realize I studied him in return, watching his hands, learning his art. With each stroke, he built not merely an image, but a window. Winston sees what he wants, a specimen that proves his theory. He does not see how the ledgers speak to me, how numbers confess what words conceal. 3 years observing, 3 years recording, 3 years smiling. The calculations are complete. The adjustments have been made. Even if they uncover my methods, the damage cannot be undone. I will remain in the frame, watching as understanding dawns. Hardwick sat back, heart pounding in the stillness of the little room. The cellar Winston had written about in his diary. The confined experiment. The young man with the practiced smile. This was where Elijah had been kept. And here, in the hidden interior of an ordinary drawer, he had continued his work, writing without ink, without paper, carving his thoughts directly into the furniture of his prison. Not just numbers. Ideas. Observations. A philosophy of escape. The portrait, he insisted, was not merely an image. It was a window. When Hardwick left the room that day, he carried with him more than names and dates. He carried the sense that he had stepped into the aftermath of someone else's long, methodical plan. A boy raised as property, taught to calculate and account like a machine. A man who learned to turn those same tools against his owner. A smile drilled into him until it became not just a performance, but a mask behind which he could think freely. Winston believed he had sealed Elijah in a cellar and stamped resolved over his name. But the ledgers still bore his touch. The drawer still held his words. And somewhere, miles away in Savannah, a portrait still watched from the shadows of a storage room, its subject patiently observing every person who dared meet his gaze. Hardwick didn't yet know how far that gaze had traveled, or how long it would endure. He only knew this: Elijah Brown had been educated as an experiment. The experiment was still running, and the man in the portrait was still smiling. Hardwick should have ended his research after discovering the carvings in the drawer. Any sensible historian would have documented the findings, submitted them to the archives, and moved on. But Elijah Brown had a way of preventing endings. When Hardwick left the Winston property in late 1873, he carried with him a growing sense that Elijah's story was not simply a forgotten historical tragedy. It was unfinished. There were too many loose ends, too many contradictions, too many pieces that didn't fit the era or the logic of the world that created them. And then there was the portrait, that smile, that gaze, the sense not imagined, not exaggerated, that the subject was testing the viewer as much as the viewer was testing him. Hardwick became uneasy even writing the young man's name, but he could not let the matter rest, and so he returned to the Savannah Historical Society. Where the painting waited. The staff, who refused to work near the portrait, had been kept in a storage room with dozens of other antebellum items, porcelain, daguerreotypes, newspaper collections. But the staff at the society had opinions about that particular canvas. Hardwick noted in his journal, "Several employees have requested the painting be kept out of visible storage. They complain of feeling observed while working near it. Pierce, the archivist, insists this is irrational, yet she herself avoids passing the corner where it sits." Hardwick assumed this was superstition, but when he stepped into the dim storage room, lantern in hand, and uncovered the portrait himself, he felt the shift in the air immediately. It wasn't fear. It wasn't imagination. It was the awareness of being studied. The smile, once a gentle curve, now seemed sharper. The eyes, those eyes that Elijah had held still for 3 days, while a Charleston painter captured him, felt almost active, as though the young man had been waiting for someone to return to him. Hardwick found himself stepping back. His pulse quickened. The diary entries, the numbers carved in a drawer, the stories whispered by Sarah Jenkins, everything about Elijah suggested he was not a man easily dismissed. He studied the portrait closely, sketching details, comparing brushstrokes with known works of the Charleston artist Robert Winston Harding. His notes became increasingly agitated. His smile changes depending on the angle. "I know this cannot be, yet I am certain of it." Hardwick did something next that he never admitted in any published work. He tried to destroy the painting. Not burn it, not slash it. He was too careful a historian for that. But he attempted to poke a tiny hole through the canvas from the back, where the damage could be patched invisibly. The wood resisted the knife. Hardwick pressed harder. The blade snapped. The canvas remained untouched. The archivist later testified in correspondence that Hardwick left the society pale, unsteady, and sweating that day, claiming he was suddenly ill. He did not return to the portrait for several months, but the painting did not disappear with neglect. If anything, it became harder to ignore. The 1927 exhibition, 3 days of chaos. More than 50 years passed. Hardwick died in 1881. His research went into storage. The Winston estate continued to collapse into the earth, but the portrait remained quiet, dust-covered, waiting. In 1927, Savannah hosted an exhibition on African American history. Elijah Brown's portrait was selected as a rare example of antebellum black portraiture, despite its troubling inscription. For the first time since 1852, Elijah's smile went on public display. The painting lasted 3 days. On day 1, two museum assistants reported feeling, followed by the subject's gaze. On day 2, a visitor fainted, claiming she saw the young man's expression shift, as though he recognized her. On day 3, an elderly man unnamed in the record stood frozen in front of the portrait and whispered, "That's him. That's the Winston boy." Still smiling, when staff approached him, he couldn't explain how he recognized Elijah. He had no documented connection to the Winston family or the plantation. He simply kept repeating, "It's him." After all these years, still smiling, the painting was removed from the gallery that afternoon. 2 days later, when staff went to place it back into storage, one of the curators refused to touch it. She had been in the exhibition hall one of the evenings after closing and claimed she heard the faint sound of someone writing near the painting. The sound stopped every time she stepped closer. Eventually, she left the museum in tears. No one blamed her. The portrait was placed in deep storage, behind locked doors. Under coverings no one lifted, unless they absolutely had to. People began to avoid the room entirely. 1958. The distorted photographs in 1958. A professor from Emory University James Mercer, requested to study the portrait as part of his research on educated slaves in the antebellum South. He asked the Historical Society to photograph it. That's when things became stranger. The first photographs came out, blurred specifically around the eyes and mouth. The second photographs showed warping of the mouth, almost as though the smile had widened unnaturally. The third photographs were finally acceptable. Mercer used them in his 1960 academic article. They are grainy, imperfect, but recognizable. But in private correspondence letters found decades later, Mercer wrote, "The subject's expression seems inconsistent between exposures. At times, the smile appears almost knowing. I cannot account for this." He assumed it was light distortion, a trick of the camera, chemical variance, but the photographers disagreed. The lighting was controlled. The camera was stable. There was no technical explanation. Mercer never saw the painting again. 1964. The Disappearance. The Society decided to move the collection to an updated facility in Atlanta. On March 12, 1964, Elijah Brown's portrait was crated, sealed, and placed on a truck with 8 other artifacts. When the truck reached Atlanta, the receiving staff signed off on everything except one item. The crate containing the portrait was empty, completely empty, undamaged, unforced, unbroken. The inventory report noted, item A3, 47 missing. Crate intact, no signs of tampering. The staff filed an inquiry. Nothing came of it. The portrait was recorded as lost. Insurance was paid out an ironic sum of $800, the same price Winston once assigned to Elijah in life. But Hardwick's old notes had a later annotation, added by someone in the Historical Society decades after his death, next to the ledger entry describing the sealed cellar. A faint penciled notation, March 13, 64, decessioned. That was the day after the empty crate arrived. No one ever discovered who wrote it, and no one ever found the painting. But the story didn't end there, Beckles. While the portrait vanished, reports of it did not. Visitors to the Georgia Historical Society in the late 1960s occasionally asked, "Where is the painting of the smiling young man? I saw it earlier, where did it go?" Staff always replied, "We have no such painting on display." Some visitors insisted they had seen it hanging in a hallway, or leaning behind a door, or reflected faintly in a glass display case. Others described hearing a soft sound like pencil on paper near the storage rooms. One guard in 1967 wrote, "Sounded like someone writing," followed by something impossible, a sound like someone smiling. The next guard refused to work nights. The Winston Estate Museum project, launched in 1965, fell apart. Official reason, structural rot, cost overruns. Unofficial reason, night guards resigning in panic. Noises in the basement, claims shadows moving in the sealed room. Hardwick's final notes, found after his death, included a short line that said more than all the others. "I cannot shake the feeling that he watches still, not from the past, but from somewhere ongoing." By the time chapter 3 ends, one thing has become clear. The portrait might have vanished, but Elijah Brown did. Not from the story, not from the archives, not from the places where his smile once hung, and certainly not from the people who looked too closely. In 2002, during renovations at an old Savannah bank, once used by Francis Winston, workers broke open a sealed wall and discovered a leather portfolio filled with accounting ledgers from 1849 to 1852. Written in a hand, the archivists immediately recognized Elijah Brown's. The ledgers weren't normal plantation records. They were precise, calculated, surgical. Page after page showed tiny financial adjustments, 1% here, 2% there, so small no overseer would ever notice. Yet spread across hundreds of transactions, they quietly siphoned money out of the Winston estate for years. When forensic accountants studied the numbers, they realized Elijah had created a financial machine, a hidden system that drained Winston's wealth while leaving no trail of theft. It was brilliant, impossible, and decades ahead of anything taught to enslaved clerks. One line carried a date that froze everyone who saw it. August 19, 1852. The day before Winston claimed he locked Elijah in the cellar. Next to that date was a note in Elijah's unmistakable handwriting. Calculations complete, balance adjusted, freedom purchased, but no record existed of Elijah buying his freedom. No ticket north, no sale, no escape, no death, nothing. It was as if the man who wrote those words vanished the next day. The ledgers were sent to the Georgia Historical Society, where visitors studying them began making unusual reports not about the numbers, but about the feeling of being watched while reading them. Several claimed they felt someone standing behind them, leaning close, as if checking their math. Others said they heard a faint scratching sound, like pencil on paper, even when the room was empty. The archivist in charge insisted these were imaginative responses to an eerie story, but she herself refused to review the documents alone. Then came the strangest discovery: microscopic annotations added between the lines of the original 1850s entries. These marks were in the same style Elijah's drawer carvings, tiny, perfect, carved or etched so finely that museum staff had to use magnification to see them. The dates on these added notations range from the 1860s to the 1920s to the 1960s, and one impossible to explain was from 1998. Every annotation carried the same initials, EB, and each appeared in places no conservator could access without unsealing the glass cases, which remained locked and alarmed at all times. The archivists dismissed it as vandalism, but no tool marks matched modern instruments. No alarms had ever been triggered. The ledgers remained untouched yet changed. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. Elijah Brown had learned to disappear from rooms, from portraits, from records, but not from numbers, not from the systems he once mastered. His writing kept reappearing. His initials kept resurfacing. His presence kept returning wherever his story was studied too closely. And every new discovery carried the same quiet message, unspoken, but undeniable. He was not finished. In 2018, the Telfair Museums in Savannah received an anonymous box with no return address, no donor name, and no explanation, just a small leather-bound sketchbook, old, worn, and sealed with a simple ribbon. At first, the staff treated it like any other 19th century artifact, but when they opened it, they froze. Pressed faintly into the back cover were two letters burned into the leather. EB. Inside the sketchbook were dozens of drawings, faces, expressions, studies of eyes, shadows, and angles, and on nearly every page, the same young man appeared, calm, composed, always with that practiced, unreadable smile. Experts dated the materials to the mid-1800s, the same period Elijah lived at the Winston estate. It wasn't the artwork itself that unsettled them, it was what the drawings showed. Elijah had sketched the Winston family in private moments, the master arguing with his wife, visitors asleep by the fire, servants whispering in hallways. None were posed, none were formal. They looked like scenes someone had watched from a doorway or from shadows. Each sketch had notes written in the margins, times, dates, habits, weak points, all recorded with the precision of someone studying not people, but patterns. Then the images began to shift. Halfway through the book, the studies became tutorials, detailed diagrams on how to paint eyes, perspective, smiles, and the illusion of a figure watching the viewer. These notes matched techniques later found in Harding's paintings, the same Harding who supposedly painted Elijah's portrait. But the most disturbing pages were near the end. They showed the faces of people Elijah should never have known: Hardwick, the old archivist from 1927, Mercer the professor from 1958, people who lived decades after Elijah's disappearance. No names were written, just sketches of their faces, each accompanied by a single notation, observed, and then the final page. A single sentence written in tight, perfect script: the frame is not a prison, the frame is a doorway. When the museum catalogued the sketchbook, they stored it under controlled security, but within a week, Staff reported seeing someone in the closed archives, a young man standing just beyond the rows of shelves, smiling faintly, always gone when approached. Motion sensors triggered alarms with no one present. One conservator, checking the sketchbook late at night, refused to return to that room. She claimed the last page had changed, a new line written, where none had been before, "I see you." No one else could verify it. When others checked, the page remained blank except for the original sentence. The museum director ordered the sketchbook moved to deeper storage. But the night they transferred it, the technician carrying the box swore he felt someone walking behind him the entire way, silent steps matching his own, until he reached the vault. When he locked the door, the footsteps stopped. The security cameras recorded nothing. The sketchbook remains sealed today, never displayed, never published. Yet every few months, someone in the museum claims to glimpse a young man with a calm smile in the reflections of glass cases, watching them with the same expression captured in the sketches. And though the museum denies anything unusual, the staff all agree on one thing: the smile is always the same. In the years after the sketchbook surfaced, researchers began revisiting something that had quietly troubled art historians for decades: the Harding paintings. Robert Winston Harding, the Charleston artist who painted Elijah's original portrait in 1852, continued producing work for another 11 years. But starting in 1853, something changed in his art. It began subtly: a shadow in a window, a figure standing far in the background, a face half hidden among a group of servants. Most scholars dismissed these as artistic quirks until Dr. Eleanor Hayes published her 1998 analysis showing that the same face appeared in 7 different Harding paintings across 10 years, in locations hundreds of miles apart. The face was unmistakable: a young black man, composed posture, eyes that followed the viewer, and a faint, knowing smile, the same smile Elijah practiced 4 weeks at Winston's command. Harding never mentioned this recurring figure in his journals, not once, yet imaging technology confirmed that in several pieces, the background figure had been added after the initial layers dried, sometimes months later. Even more disturbing, infrared analysis showed that Harding had originally painted different expressions on the main subject's face's expressions that were later altered. A proud planter's face adjusted to look anxious, a society matron's smile subtly lowered into unease, a child's innocent expression replaced with one of quiet fear. Every time Elijah's faint figure appeared somewhere at the scene, watching them, watching Harding, watching the viewer. Art historians began asking the same question: was Harding painting Elijah, or was Elijah directing Harding? Harding's decline by 1859. Harding's behavior had changed dramatically. Letters from friends described him as paranoid, sleep-deprived, and increasingly terrified of his own work. In a letter to his sister dated October 1852, just 6 months after painting Elijah's portrait, Harding wrote, "I feel eyes on me even when the room is empty, not from the living, but from the frames. He watches me as I work, not I him. I find additions to my canvases that I do not recall painting." His family dismissed this as stress, but then came the incident in 1863, when Harding locked himself in his studio for 3 days, refusing food, insisting someone else was moving through the paintings. When he finally emerged, he refused to touch a paintbrush ever again. He was admitted to a sanitarium near Charleston soon afterward, where he spent the last years of his life refusing to look at mirrors, to walk past framed pictures, or to enter rooms with paintings when the staff asked why. He said the same thing: he steps between them. He stepped out of mine. I helped him without knowing it. Harding died in 1867. Modern evidence in the early 2000s. Conservators analyzing Harding's surviving canvases found something no one expected: tiny microscopic initials EB carved into the inner edges of several frames, not visible to the naked eye, not part of any restoration work, not matching Harding's hand. The initials appeared in the 1853 Charleston merchant portrait, the 1855 Beaufort family painting, the 1857 plantation veranda scene, and the 1860 Richmond Street portrait each time placed near the background figure the figure with Elijah's face. Worse still, each carving was dated, some from the 1850s, some from the 1880s, one from 1921, one from 1954. One from 2003. All in the same perfect upright script. All impossible. The 2023 High Museum incident in 2023. An Emory University art history professor visiting the High Museum in Atlanta reported seeing a familiar face in an 1860 portrait of a Georgia judge. Behind the judge, faintly visible through a window in the painting, she saw a young black man with a calm expression and a slight smile. The same face I saw in Harding's works, the same face from the Elijah Brown sketchbook. But when museum staff inspected the painting, nothing was there. Photographs from previous decades showed no such figure. Yet the professor insisted he was there, watching me, and he wanted me to notice. Others in the gallery that day later admitted they felt uneasy, observed, or not alone, though they never saw the figure directly. Within days, the museum quietly re-examined every 19th century painting in its collection. They found nothing, and yet many staff refused to work in the portrait gallery at night afterward. They said the same thing the Telfair staff said about the sketchbook. The smile was the same. It was always the same, and it never stopped watching. Elijah had once said, the frame was not a prison. By the end of chapter 7. It is clear he meant it. By the 2000s, researchers studying Elijah Brown's trail noticed something none of them wanted to say aloud. Every time his story resurfaced, every ledger found, every sketch discovered, every painting re-examined, something new appeared that had never been there before. In 2021, archivists at the Charleston Museum uncovered a misplaced daguerreotype showing an artist's studio in 1853. On the easel was a Harding painting still in progress. But in the photograph scene of the canvas barely visible in the background, a young man with Elijah's unmistakable smile stood in a field, watching the painter work. On the back of the photograph, nearly erased with age, a line appeared after digital enhancements. He watches as I work. Not I him, but he me. In 2023, museum visitors around the country began independently reporting the same phenomenon, the sudden appearance of a quiet, smiling young man in the backgrounds of 19th century paintings where no such figure existed before. These sightings never lasted. Photo evidence always vanished. Staff always found the canvases unchanged, but the descriptions were identical every time. The same calm eyes, the same practiced smile, the same expression from the lost 1852 portrait. Conservators examining these paintings found microscopic notations hidden inside frames, tiny carvings reading EB, dated not only in the 1800s, but also in the 1920s, the 1950s, the 1990s, and even 2019, long after the paintings were sealed behind museum glass. No alarms ever triggered, no cases were opened, yet the marks appeared. The final breakthrough came in 2024, when the Georgia Historical Society received an anonymous package containing new Winston ledgers dated 1849 to 1852, but inside those ledgers were notes in Elijah's handwriting referencing events from decades after his death: Hardwick's 1873 visit, the 1927 exhibition, the 1964 disappearance of the portrait, the 1998 night guard sightings, and at the very end of the book, a page written in modern ink, not carved, not faded. He's still watching. The portrait was never the prison he left. It was the door through which he stepped. That same week, during construction on the subdivision built over the old Winston estate, workers unearthed a metal box containing a perfect pencil sketch of Elijah's smiling face. Signed EB. The developer threw it away, not knowing what it was. Residents living near the former cellar site later reported strange sensations, whispers like pencil on paper, footsteps following them in empty halls, and reflections of a smiling young man in dark windows. Meanwhile, art curators around the country noticed subtle changes in portraits after long periods in storage: a shifted shadow, an altered angle, a faint figure now standing where none had been before. Nothing dramatic, nothing provable, but consistent enough that museum staff began quietly documenting the incidents, and all of them pointed to the same conclusion. Elijah Brown had found a way out, not through death, not through escape, but through the frame itself, the portrait he was forced to sit for, the smile he was forced to practice. The doorway Winston intended as a display became the opening Elijah chose as freedom. Today, in galleries from Savannah to Charleston to Richmond, visitors still report the same quiet feeling that somewhere, in the background of a painting, a young man is watching them with a calm, patient smile, a smile that never belonged to Winston, a smile that was never submission, a smile that says, "I am still here," because Elijah Brown was educated as an experiment, and the experiment never ended.